The last time I heard my father's voice was through a cracked window on a November evening, standing in the driveway of the house I grew up in while my stepmother stood on the other side of the front door and told me he was sleeping. He wasn't sleeping. I could hear him. He was calling my name. I want you to sit with that for a second. A man on his deathbed in the final days of his life, calling for his daughter, and the woman who controlled every door in that house standing between us with her arms crossed and a look on her face that I will never forget as long as I live. That was the moment I understood who Sandra really was. Not the woman who had smiled through her wedding to my father 12 years earlier. Not the woman who had made polite conversation at holidays and remembered my coffee order. The real Sandra. The one who had been quietly, patiently building something behind every warm smile and every reasonable sentence, waiting for exactly this moment. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old. My father, James, was 67 when he died. He was a structural engineer who built bridges for 30 years, a man who could look at a river and tell you exactly where the tension would hold and where it would fail. He was quiet and methodical and deeply, privately loving. He was also, in the last 12 years of his life, completely in love with a woman who understood exactly how to use that love against both of us. My mother died when I was 19, breast cancer 14 months from diagnosis to end. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and watching my father go through it alongside me was its own kind of heartbreak. He loved her in that old-fashioned, permanent way that some people manage, the kind where you can see 30 years of history just in the way two people hand each other a cup of coffee. After she died, he was lost for almost 2 years, quiet in a way that wasn't his normal quiet, absent in small, daily ways that accumulated like snow. He met Sandra at a work conference. She was the event coordinator. She was 51, polished, quick-laughing, and she pursued him with a focused, cheerful energy that he later described to me as like being caught in a very pleasant current. They dated for 2 years. I was 24 when they married. I was cautious, of course I was cautious, but I wanted my father to be happy. I had watched him be gray and diminished for long enough, so I smiled at the wedding. I helped carry boxes when she moved in. I tried. Sandra was never cruel to me. I want to be clear about that because this story gets complicated and I don't want to simplify it in ways that aren't fair. She was never mean. She was never openly hostile. What she was, I would later understand, was strategic. Every boundary she drew had a reasonable explanation. Every time she pulled my father a little further into their shared world and a little further from me, there was a logical reason attached. He's tired. We have plans. He's not feeling well. The holidays are just so stressful. Maybe you could come the day after instead. Reasonable reasons, one after another, for 12 years, until I looked up one day and realized I had drifted so far from my father that the distance felt normal. Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February of what would be his last year. Sandra called me with the news, and her voice on the phone was composed and informative in a way that felt slightly wrong, not cold exactly, but managed. She told me the prognosis. She told me the treatment plan. She told me she would keep me updated. When I said I was coming down that weekend, she said he wasn't up for visitors yet. He needed rest. She would let me know when a good time would be. I should have fought harder then. That is the thing I have to live with. I accepted the delay. I called my father on his cell phone and he answered, and we talked for 40 minutes about the diagnosis, about treatment, about my job, about a documentary he'd been watching about suspension bridges, and he sounded like himself. Tired, but like himself. He said Sandra was taking great care of him and that I shouldn't worry. He said we'd see each other soon. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Because believing something easier is always available, and the alternative, sitting with the fact that something was wrong, that I was being managed, was too painful to hold for long. The weeks that followed had a pattern I only recognized in hindsight. Every time I tried to come visit, there was a reason to wait. Dad's numbers weren't good this week. He'd had a rough night. The doctor had recommended limited visitors during this phase of treatment. Sandra always had an explanation, and the explanation always sounded reasonable, and I always accepted it. Meanwhile, she was posting photographs on Facebook. Dad in the garden, Dad at the kitchen table. Dad smiling with Sandra's adult daughter from her first marriage, a woman named Brittany who I had met exactly 4 times in 12 years and who appeared to have become a regular presence in that house while I was being asked to wait. It was my father's oldest friend, a man named Gerald who'd known Dad since their university days, who finally called me with a different version of reality. Gerald had gone to visit Dad and had been let in. He'd called ahead. Sandra had seemed to think he was coming on a different day, and he'd simply shown up before she could arrange a reason. He sat with Dad for 2 hours. He called me afterward, and his voice had a careful quality that told me he was choosing words very deliberately. He said Dad had asked about me 3 times during the visit. He said Dad seemed confused about why I hadn't been coming around. He said Dad had told him that Sandra had told him I was very busy with work, that I'd said I would try to come when things settled down, that I had called and said I needed a little more time. Gerald said he hadn't known what to say because none of that matched what I had been telling him. Dad thought I was staying away by choice. I sat in my car in a parking garage for 20 minutes after that call, and I could not move. Sandra had told my dying father that I was choosing not to come. While she was telling me he was too sick for visitors, she was telling him I was too busy to visit. She had built a false version of me in his mind, a daughter who wasn't showing up, while simultaneously keeping me at a distance with excuses that I had accepted like a fool. My father was dying in a house 40 miles away, thinking his daughter had prioritized her schedule over his final months. I drove straight there. I did not call ahead. I did not send a message. I pulled into that driveway at 7 in the evening, walked up to the front door and knocked. Sandra answered in about 30 seconds, which told me she had seen me pull up. She stood in the doorway with a pleasant, measured expression and said this wasn't a good time. Dad had had a difficult day. The doctor wanted him to rest. I said I wasn't leaving. I said I needed to see my father. I said I knew what she had been telling him. Something moved behind her eyes, just briefly. Then the pleasant expression returned and she said she didn't know what I was talking about and that she was going to ask me to leave and that if I didn't she would call the police. I stood on that porch. I heard from somewhere inside the house, from the direction of what used to be the living room where I knew they'd set up a hospital bed, I heard my name. My father's voice, thin and reduced but absolutely recognizable, calling my name. Claire. And Sandra stepped forward and pulled the front door nearly closed behind her, blocking the opening with her body, and told me again to leave. I drove home. I don't fully know why. Shock maybe, the paralysis of not knowing what I was legally allowed to do. I drove home and I called my father's cell phone and it went to voicemail. And I left a message telling him I loved him and I was trying to get to him. And the next morning Sandra texted me saying she had spoken to a lawyer, and that as his spouse she had the legal right to determine appropriate visitors during his medical care, and that if I came back without an invitation she would pursue a no-contact order. A no-contact order to keep a daughter from her dying father. I had a friend from college who had become a family law attorney. I called her that night. She told me what I was dealing with was not a simple situation, that Sandra as his spouse did have significant authority in some respects, but that there were also avenues to challenge that authority, particularly if I could demonstrate that Dad himself wanted contact and was being denied it. She told me to document everything and to move quickly, because we did not know how much time there was. We moved quickly. My attorney filed an emergency motion requesting court-appointed access to my father. We submitted Gerald's account as a declaration. We submitted the voicemail from my father's phone that I had saved from 2 weeks earlier, in which he had said, clearly on tape, that he wished he could see me more and that he hoped things settled down for me soon, proving that Sandra's false narrative had reached him. We also requested that the court appoint an independent patient advocate to speak with my father and determine his actual wishes regarding visitors. Sandra's attorney responded fast and hard. They submitted medical records indicating Dad's condition was fragile. They submitted a letter from the home hospice nurse saying that agitation and stress were contraindicated for someone in his state. They argued I was the one creating stress. They argued Sandra was protecting her husband. They made me sound like a problem that needed managing, and for a moment reading those documents, I felt a rage so complete I couldn't speak. The court appointed an independent advocate. Her name was Dr. Farrow, and she was a retired geriatric social worker with a calm, no-nonsense manner and the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by anything comfortable. She visited my father on a Thursday afternoon alone, with Sandra required by court order to remain outside the room for the duration of the interview. Dr. Farrow spent 90 minutes with him. She submitted her report to the court 5 days later. The report was 4 pages. I read it 3 times. Dr. Farrow's findings were clear. My father was lucid, was aware of his diagnosis and prognosis, and had strong capacity to express his own wishes. His wishes, stated directly and without ambiguity during the interview, were to see his daughter before he died. He stated that he had been told I was unavailable. He stated that when he had tried to call me on his cell phone on multiple recent occasions, the calls had not gone through. Dr. Farrow noted that his cell phone, when she asked to see it, showed that it had been set to forward all incoming calls to Sandra's number. His phone had been set to forward calls to Sandra. Every call I had placed to my father's cell phone for the past 2 months had rung on Sandra's phone instead. Every voicemail I had left him had landed in her inbox. He had never heard them. He had tried to call me, and those calls from a forwarded line had appeared on my phone as Sandra's number, which I had stopped answering because I thought she was calling to deliver another excuse. We had been reaching for each other across a distance that Sandra had engineered, and neither of us had known the other was on the other end. The court granted emergency access within 48 hours of Dr. Farrow's report. Sandra was required by court order to permit me to visit my father for a minimum of 2 hours per day, unsupervised for as long as he remained alive. Her attorney tried to appeal. The judge denied it same day with a written rebuke that used the phrase willful interference with a familial relationship and recommended the matter be reviewed for elder abuse. I walked into that house on a cold Wednesday morning with a court order in my hand and Sandra standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and her attorney on the phone. I walked past her. I walked down the hall to the room where my father was. I pushed open the door. He was smaller than I remembered, diminished by the illness in the way that cancer diminishes people not just physically but in some quality of presence that you can't fully describe until you've seen it. He was in the hospital bed, propped up on pillows, and when I walked through the door his face changed in a way that broke me completely open. He reached out his hand. I sat with him for 4 hours that first day. We didn't talk about Sandra, we didn't talk about any of it. We talked about my mother, we talked about a camping trip we'd taken when I was 9. We talked about the bridge he was most proud of designing, a pedestrian footbridge over a creek in a county park that most people drove past without looking at. He said the ones nobody notices are sometimes the most important ones because they just work quietly and hold things together without asking for attention. I thought about that for a long time after. I visited every day for the next 11 days. On the 12th day, my father died. I was there, I was holding his hand. Sandra was on the other side of the bed. We did not speak to each other. The nurse came in afterward and there was a quiet, procedural kindness to everything that happens in those moments, and I held it together until I got to my car and then I did not hold it together anymore. The funeral was 6 days later. Sandra arranged everything, which was her right as his spouse. I was listed in the obituary. I sat in the third row behind Sandra and Brittany and Sandra's sister, who I had met twice. People came up to me and offered condolences and said what a wonderful man he was, and I agreed with all of them because he was. And I kept my face composed through the entire service with a focused determination that I think was the hardest thing I have ever done. The will reading was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral at the office of my father's estate attorney, a man named Howard who had handled my father's legal affairs for almost 15 years. Sandra arrived with Brittany and her own attorney. I arrived with mine. We sat in a conference room with a long wooden table and a window that looked out on a parking structure, and Howard put on his reading glasses and opened a manila folder and began. My father had made his first will 11 years ago, shortly after marrying Sandra. Howard had drafted it. The original document left the house and most of the primary assets to Sandra as surviving spouse, with a significant portion, 30% of the investment accounts, his personal belongings, and a sum of $200,000 designated for me. It was not equal, but it was clear, it was thoughtful, it was my father. Sandra's attorney shifted in his seat. I watched him. Howard continued. He explained that approximately 18 months ago my father had come to his office and made changes to the will. Sandra had accompanied him to that first meeting, Howard said, but my father had requested a follow-up meeting alone without her and had come back the following week by himself. Howard paused there and looked over his glasses, and in that pause I understood that he was telling us something important about the sequence of events. The changes my father had made 18 months ago, alone, without Sandra in a private follow-up meeting, were significant. The house, which had been purchased before the marriage with money that included my mother's life insurance payout and was therefore subject to certain protections, had been placed into a trust with dual beneficiaries. Sandra retained lifetime use of the property, meaning she could live there until her death, but upon her death or voluntary departure, the property transferred to me. The investment accounts, which had grown considerably, were divided differently than the original will. Sandra received 60%, I received 40%, and there was a letter. A separate sealed letter, not part of the legal document, with my name on it in my father's handwriting, that Howard passed across the table to me while Sandra's attorney sat very still. I didn't open the letter in that room. I held it in my lap and I kept my face neutral and I let Howard finish. Sandra received her 60% and her lifetime use of the house. Her attorney looked like a man who had expected something different. Brittany was not mentioned in the will at all. Not once. I watched Sandra's face as Howard read that part, the part where her daughter, who had been a regular presence in that house during my father's final months, who had appeared in all those Facebook photographs, received nothing, and I saw something move through Sandra's expression that she couldn't quite control. Surprise, or something close to it. She had expected more, perhaps she had expected it all. I don't know exactly what she had been told or what she had assumed, but the arithmetic of her face in that moment told me the document she had been anticipating was not the one being read aloud. I opened my father's letter in my car in the parking structure. It was 3 pages handwritten in the careful, slightly cramped script he'd used his entire life. I am not going to share all of it because some of it belongs only to me, but I will tell you what he said at the beginning because it is the part I have returned to most often in the months since. He wrote, "Claire, if you're reading this, then I didn't get to say everything I wanted to say in person. I want you to know that I knew toward the end what was happening. I'm not as easy to fool as people think. I made my arrangements quietly and I made them deliberately because the most important thing to me was that you understood. I never stopped choosing you. I never stopped being your father. Whatever it looked like from the outside, I want you to know what it looked like from the inside." He had known, somewhere in that house, lying in that hospital bed, diminished and managed and told that his daughter was too busy to come. He had known that something wasn't right. In 18 months before his death, when he could still drive himself to a lawyer's office and sit alone in a conference room and speak for himself, he had done something about it. He had made sure that whatever Sandra built around him in those final months could not undo what he had already put in place. My father built bridges. He understood where the tension would hold. Even at the end, he found a way to build something that would hold after he was gone. The estate settled over the following 4 months. Sandra contested nothing formally. Her attorney, I think, counseled her correctly that the will was airtight, that Howard had documented the solo meeting carefully, that any challenge would be expensive and probably unsuccessful. She moved out of the house 8 months after Dad's death, relocating to Arizona to be near Brittany. The house transferred to me as the trust specified. I drove out there on the day I got the keys. Fall again, almost a full year after that night in the driveway when I had stood outside and heard my father calling my name. The garden was overgrown. Sandra had not kept it up. The back porch railing needed repair. Inside, the house smelled different, like someone else's cleaning products and someone else's cooking, and the furniture arrangement had changed, and most of my father's things had been boxed and moved somewhere. But the bones of it were the same. The floors, the windows, the particular way the light came through the kitchen in the late afternoon. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I thought about my father at that table, working his way through the newspaper the way he always did, reading pieces out loud when something caught his attention. I thought about my mother in that kitchen and about the specific texture of growing up in a house where both of your parents are present and solid in yours. I thought about everything that had been taken from me in those final months and what it had cost, and what had been returned. The elder abuse referral that the judge had recommended was investigated. The phone tampering, forwarding my father's calls without his knowledge or consent, became the centerpiece of that investigation. Sandra's attorney argued it had been done with my father's permission for convenience. The investigator interviewed the hospice nurse, Gerald, Dr. Farrow, and Howard. The investigation concluded with a civil finding and a financial penalty. No criminal charges were filed, which I have complicated feelings about, but there is a permanent record. It exists. It says what happened. I renovated the porch railing myself. I'm not particularly handy, but I watched enough videos and was stubborn enough to make it work. I replanted the garden the following spring, not the same plants Sandra had let die, but new ones, including a rose bush that I put in the corner of the yard where my mother used to sit. I don't know if that's symbolic or just practical. Maybe it's both. My father would probably say that the distinction doesn't matter as long as the structure holds. People ask me if I forgave Sandra. I think they expect me to say yes because that's the tidy ending, the one that resolves cleanly and makes a story feel finished. But I'm going to tell you the truth, I don't think about Sandra very much anymore. I don't carry anger at her in any active way. What I carry instead is something harder to name, a clarity maybe about what greed does to a person. About how it narrows everything down until the only thing that matters is the transaction, and everything that cannot be converted into something owned or controlled gets discarded. I don't know what Sandra thought she was building in those 12 years. Whatever it was, she built it on something that couldn't hold. My father understood load-bearing structures better than almost anyone. He understood the difference between something that looked solid and something that actually was. He worked quietly without fanfare, building things that would outlast him, and when the moment came that mattered most, he did exactly what he had always done. He built something for me that held. I sit on that porch now on weekend mornings with coffee and I watch the light move across the yard, and sometimes I talk to him out loud a little, the way people do when they're not quite ready to fully accept that someone is gone. I tell him about my week. I tell him about the garden. Once, I told him about the footbridge, how I had driven out to that county park on a Saturday and walked across the pedestrian bridge he designed, the one nobody notices, the one that just holds things together without asking for attention. I stood in the middle of it for a long time looking at the creek below. It held.